When Mandragora finished her schooling and returned to the villa by the Rhine, a villa dedicated to Saint Nepomuk, Professor Ten Brinken was 76 years old. But this was only according to the calendar. No weakness, nor the slightest disability gave evidence of his age. He felt snug and warm in his old village, a village soon to be swallowed up by the creeping fingers of the town, and hung like a bloated spider in the web of his machinations, which spread its filaments in all directions. And he felt a frisson at the thought of Mandra's homecoming, and waited for her as for a welcome plaything, for his moods, and also as a merry bait to lure many a stupid fly or moth into his net. Mandra arrived, and she did not seem any different to the old man than she had been as a child. He studied her for a long time as she was sitting in the library and found nothing to remind him of her father or her mother. This young girl was small and dainty, slim, narrow-chested, and scarcely developed. Her figure and her quick, rather jerky movements were those of a boy. A doll, you might have thought, but the head was certainly not that of a doll. Her cheekbones were prominent, and her lips, thin and pale, were pursed above her little teeth. But her hair was thick and abundant, not red like her mother's, but richly chestnut in color. Like Mrs. Josepha Gontram's, thought the professor, and it amused him to think that this was a memento of the house where the idea of creating the girl had emerged. He squinted across at her as she sat silently before him, scrutinizing her critically as though she were a picture, and seeking other reminiscences. Yes, her eyes. They were open wide beneath the insolent thin lines of her brows, which contrasted with her narrow, smooth forehead. They could be bold and scornful, yet also soft and dreamy, grass green and hard as steel, like the eyes of Frank Braun, his nephew. The professor thrust forward his thick bottom lip. This discovery did not please him particularly. But then he shrugged his shoulders. Why shouldn't the boy who thought it all up not have some part of her? It was little enough, and Frank Braun was paying dearly for it, all the millions that this girl would take from him. "You have bright eyes," he said. She simply nodded. He went on, "You have beautiful hair. Wolfie's mother had hair like that." Then Mandra said, "I shall cut it off." The professor answered her in a peremptory fashion. "You will do no such thing, do you hear?" But when she came down to supper, her long hair had gone. She looked like a page boy, her curls circling her boyish head. "What have you done to your hair?" he snapped. She quietly answered, "Here," and showed him a large cardboard box where the long strands were lying. "But why did you cut it off? Because I forbade it? Out of defiance?" Mandra smiled. "Not at all. I would have done it anyway." He stared at her, and his old skin experienced a gentle tingling. All sorts of memories came flooding back, lascivious memories of pubescent boys and girls. She there, Mandra, was both male and female. Damp spittle oozed from his pendulous lips and moistened the black Havana. He peered across at her, lustful, full of trembling desire. And at that moment he understood why it was that men were attracted to these slim little creatures. Like fish that swim to the bait and don't see the hook. But he saw the sharp hook very clearly, and knew how to avoid it and still enjoy the sweet morsel. On February 2nd, the sleighs and automobiles drove out to the Vintage Hotel for society's most splendid carnival ball. Royalty was present, accompanied by anyone in the town who possessed a uniform, be it military or of the student fraternities with their caps and sashes. The academic circles were represented, as was the legal profession. There were civil servants, counselors, and anyone who had money, businessmen and industrialists. Judge Gontram was sitting at the table reserved for eminent guests. He knew the wine cellar well and was able to obtain the best vintages. Princess Volkonsky was there with her daughter, the Countess Figuera-Yabrantes, and Frida Gontram, Wolfie's sister, who had been visiting the princess that winter. Then there was the lawyer Maness, a few lecturers and scholars as well as officers, and our Professor Ten Brinken, who was accompanying his little daughter to her first ball. Mandra appeared as Mademoiselle du Mappin in the costume of a young gallant a la Beardsley. She had previously torn open all the wardrobes in the Ten Brinken villa and rummaged through old chests and boxes until she finally discovered piles of Belgian lace dating from a long time ago. The tears of poor seamstresses, crouched in dark cellars, clung without doubt to these edgings and borders, as they did to all the beautiful lace worn by society belles, but much fresher tears moistened Mandragora's cheeky costume. Those of the dressmaker who had been constantly scolded for not having grasped what the dress was supposed to mean, the hairdresser who did not understand the hairstyle and couldn't do chi-chis, and the little maid whom she pricked with long needles during dressing. What a torment it was, arranging Gautier's girl according to the Englishman's bizarre conception. But when it was finished, when the moody lad in his high-heeled shoes and dainty little dagger strutted through the room, there was no eye that did not follow him greedily, neither young nor old, neither man nor woman. The Chevalier du Mappin shared his success with Rosalind. The Rosalind of the last scene of Shakespeare's play was played by Wolf Gontram, and the stage never saw a more beautiful one, not in Shakespeare's time, when slender boys played the part of girls, nor later, when Margaret Hughes, the mistress of Prince Rupert, was the first woman to play the pretty girl in As You Like It. Mandra had dressed him. She had taken great pains to teach him how to walk, how to dance, how to hold his fan, and how to smile. And as she seemed to be a boy, and yet also a girl in Beardsley's costume, a creature kissed on the brow by both Hermes and Aphrodite, so Wolf Gontram no less incorporated the figure of Beardsley's great countryman who had written the sonnets. In his robe of gold and scarlet brocade, he was a pretty girl, yet also a boy. Her Majesty sent an adjutant and summoned the two of them to present themselves. She danced the first waltz with them both, first as a gentleman with Rosalind, then as a lady with the Chevalier du Mappin, and she burst into loud applause when, in a minuet, Théophile Gautier's curly-headed dream boy bowed in a coquettish fashion before Shakespeare's lovely dream girl. Her Majesty was an excellent dancer, an outstanding player on the tennis court and the best ice skater in the town, and would have preferred to dance with the two of them all night long. But the crowd also wished to stake its claim, and so Mademoiselle de Mappin and Rosalind flew from one partner to another, now pressed by the muscular arms of young men, then held against the warm, heaving breasts of young women. The orchestra was playing, soft and seductive, Roses from the South. Mandra seized Wolfie's hand and pulled him away. "Come, Wolfie, let's dance." They moved to the center of the floor and presented themselves. A gray-bearded art historian noticed them, climbed on his chair and shouted, "Silence! A waltz expressly for the Chevalier du Mappin and his Rosalind." Several hundred pairs of eyes rested on the pretty couple. Mandra sensed this, and every step she took was taken in the knowledge that she was being admired. But Wolf Gontram was aware of nothing. He only knew that he was in her arms, and was carried by soft strains of music, and his large black eyebrows sunk, and shaded his deep, dreamlike eyes. The Chevalier du Mappin led, surely, confidently, like a slim page who has known the smooth dance floor since his cradle. His head was bent slightly forwards, his left hand held Rosalind with 2 fingers, and at the same time the golden pommel of his sword, which he pushed downwards so that its point thrust upwards the lacy tail of his coat. His powdered locks swayed like little silver snakes, his lips were parted in a smile which revealed his sparkling teeth, and Rosalind obeyed the gentle pressure. Her train of red and gold swept across the floor, and her figure rose above it like a lovely blossom. Her head was bent backwards, and the white ostrich feathers hung heavily from her hat. She swayed beneath the garland of roses, rapt, transported, remote from all that existed. Round and round and round the room. The guests pushed their way to the edge of the floor, and those who could not see climbed onto tables and chairs in breathless admiration. "I congratulate you, Your Excellency," murmured Princess Volkonsky, and the professor answered, "Thank you, Your Highness. It appears that all our efforts were not quite in vain." The waltz ceased, and Mandra led Wolf through the cheering crowd and the deluge of roses into the corner of the room. She noticed a small door which led onto the balcony, half concealed by a heavy curtain. "Ah, that's good," she said. "Come, Wolfie." She drew back the curtain, turned the key, and placed her hand on the doorknob. But suddenly she felt 5 coarse fingers on her arm. "What are you up to?" asked a grating voice. She turned and noticed the lawyer, Manas, in his black costume. "What are you going out there for?" She shook off his ugly hand. "What's it to do with you?" she answered. We're only going for a breath of fresh air." He nodded vigorously. "I thought so. That's why I followed you. But you won't do it, you won't." Mandragora rose to her full height and looked at him insolently. "And why not? Do you think you can stop us?" He flinched involuntarily beneath her gaze, but would not give in. "Yes, I shall stop you, me. Don't you understand that it's madness? You're both glowing hot, bathed in sweat, and you want to go out on the balcony when it's -12 outside?" "We're going," insisted Mandragora. "All right," he yelped. "You go. It's a matter of total indifference what you do, miss. I only want to prevent the boy from going." Mandra looked at him from top to toe. She pulled the key from the lock and opened the door. "So," she said. She stepped out onto the balcony and beckoned to Rosalind. "Will you come out into the winter night with me?" Wolf Gontram pushed the lawyer aside and quickly stepped through the door. Manas grabbed him and held his arm tightly, but Wolf silently pushed him again, so that he fell awkwardly against the heavy curtain. "Don't go, Wolf!" the lawyer screamed. "Don't go!" He was almost wailing, and his hoarse voice cracked. But Mandragora was laughing out loud. "Adieu, faithful retainer." She slammed the door in his face, put the key in the lock, and turned it twice. The two of them walked through the snow and leaned over the balustrade, Rosalind and the Chevalier du Maupin. The full moon was shining down onto the wide street below and cast its sweet light onto the Baroque architecture of the university and the Archbishop's venerable palace. The moonlight danced over the glittering white expanse and threw fantastic shadows across the pavements. Wolf Gontram drank in the icy air. "How lovely," he said, and pointed at the white street below, whose silence was absolute. But Mandragora was looking up at him, at his white shoulders gleaming in the moonlight, at his large eyes, shiny like two black opals. "You are lovely," she said. "You are far more beautiful than the moonlight." Then he loosened his grip on the stone balustrade, seized her, and embraced her. "Mandra," he cried, "Mandra." She tolerated this for one moment, then tore herself free and struck him lightly on the hand. "No," she laughed. "No, you are Rosalind, and I am the boy, so I shall pay court to you." She looked round, seized a chair from the corner, dragged it forwards, and beat the snow from it with her sword. "Come sit here, my lovely lady. You are unfortunately too tall for me. So, that's right, we're the same height now." She bowed daintily and sat down on one knee. "Rosalind," she fluted, "Rosalind, may a wandering knight steal a kiss?" "Mandra," he began, but she jumped up and put her hand across his mouth. "You must say sir," she cried. "So, may I steal a kiss, Rosalind?" "Yes, sir," he stammered. Then she stepped behind him and took his head in both hands, and she began trembling, one after another. "First your ears," she laughed, "the right and the left, and both cheeks, and the silly nose. I've kissed that often enough. And finally, take care, Rosalind, your beautiful mouth." She bent forwards and thrust her curly head across his shoulder, under the wide hat. But then she started back. "No, pretty maiden, put your hands modestly in your lap." He laid his trembling hands upon his knees and closed his eyes. And so she kissed him, long and passionately. But her little teeth finally sought his lips and quickly bit him, so that heavy drops of blood fell into the snow. Then she tore herself away and stood before him, gazing wide-eyed at the moon. She shivered, and her slender limbs were trembling. "I'm freezing," she whispered, and lifted first one foot, then the other. "The stupid snow has got everywhere into my lace slippers." She took off a shoe and beat the snow out of it. "Put on my shoes," he cried. "They are bigger and warmer." He quickly pulled them off and let her slip into them. "Is that better?" "Yes," she laughed, "much better. I shall give you another kiss for this, Rosalind." And she kissed him again, and bit him again, and both of them laughed as the moon shone on the red drops on the white snow. "Do you love me, Wolf Gontram?" she asked. And he replied, "I think of you always, constantly." She paused for a moment and then continued, "If I wanted you to, would you throw yourself from this balcony?" "Yes," he replied. "And from the roof?" He nodded. "And from the cathedral spire?" He nodded again. "Would you do anything for me, Wolfie?" she asked, and he said, "Yes, Mandra, if you loved me." She pursed her lips mockingly and gently swung her hips. "I don't know whether I do love you," she said slowly. "What would you do if I didn't love you?" Then those splendid eyes, his mother's eyes, gleamed with a darker radiance than ever, and the moon above was jealous of these human eyes, crept away and concealed itself behind the cathedral tower. "Yes," the boy said. "Yes, even then." She sat upon his lap and put her arms around his neck. "For that, Rosalind, for that I shall kiss you a third time." And she kissed him longer, more passionately. But they could no longer see the dark drops in the glittering snow as the disgruntled moon had hidden its silver torch. "Come," she whispered. "Come, we must be going." They changed their shoes, beat the snow from their clothes, and unlocked the door, slipping quietly back into the room from behind the curtain. The lamps threw their harsh light upon them, and the air, hot and stuffy, enveloped them. Wolf Gontram staggered when he let go of the curtain and quickly pressed both hands to his breast. She noticed it. "Wolfie?" she asked. He said, "It's all right, only a stitch, it's past." Hand in hand they walked through the room. Wolf Gontram was not in the office next morning. He did not get out of bed, was feverish, with a high temperature. 9 days he lay there, calling out her name in his delirium. He never regained consciousness during this time. Then he died. Inflammation of the lungs. And they buried him in the new cemetery. Miss Mandragora Ten Brinken sent a large wreath of dark roses. The Privy Councillor, His Excellency Professor Ten Brinken, was walking up and down in his room slowly, with heavy dragging steps. "Is it really so bad? How long do you think I need to go away?" Menas, the little lawyer, turned and looked at him. "For how long?" he gasped. "What kind of question is that? For as long as you live. You should count yourself lucky that this possibility remains open to you. It's certainly pleasanter to squander your millions in a villa on the Riviera than ending your days in prison. And it would be prison, I can assure you. And it's the authorities that have left this escape route for you. The prosecution could just as well have signed the warrant for your arrest this morning, and everything would have been over by now. Damned decent of them, but they would take it very badly if you didn't use this little exit. And when they decide to act, then they'll get you. And then, Your Excellency, this would be your last night as a free man." The judge said, "Flee, make your escape. It seems to me the best thing you could do." "Yes," yelped Menis, "certainly the best and, indeed, the only solution for a crook and an embezzler. Disappear into thin air and take that daughter with you. Londonic and the whole town would be grateful." The professor pricked up his ears. For the first time that evening, some sign of life entered his features, and the rigid mask of apathy slipped, that mask upon which a nervous restlessness had flickered. "Mandra," he whispered. "Mandra, if she came too." He passed his plump hand 2 or 3 times across his powerful forehead. He sat down, took a glass of wine, emptied it. "Gentlemen, I think you're right," he said. "I thank you for this. Would you please go through everything once more?" He seized the bundle of documents, shares, policies, the papers which were his undoing. The lawyer began and quietly, precisely, explained the legal technicalities. He worked through the stocks and shares, summed up each possibility of getting out, or self-defense, and Professor Ten Brinken threw in the occasional word and, as in the old days, fought and manipulated. He grew increasingly clearer in his mind, and with each new danger there was also a new suppleness in his thinking. Some papers he kept to one side. These posed no danger. But there were still sufficient number to bring about his undoing. He dictated a few letters, gave out instructions, took down notes, and suggested appeals, complaints. Then he studied the train timetable, made his plans, and gave instructions for what to do next. And when he left his office, he would claim that he had ordered his affairs to his satisfaction. He hired a taxi and was driven to Lendrick, confident and assured. And it was only when the servant opened the gate and he was walking across the courtyard and up the stairs to the mansion that his confidence left him. He looked for Mandra and felt it was a good omen that there were no guests in the house. The maid informed him that she had dined alone and was in her room. So he climbed the stairs, knocked on her door, and went in at her. "Enter." "I must talk to you," he said. She was sitting at her writing desk and briefly looked up at him. "No," she said, "it's not convenient." It's most important. It can't be delayed. She looked at him and lightly crossed one foot over the other. Not now. Go downstairs. Give me half an hour. He left, took off his fur coat, and sat on the sofa. He waited and mulled over what he would say, every sentence, every word. After a good hour had passed, he heard her footsteps. He rose and went to the door, and there she stood, dressed as a lift boy in a bright, strawberry-colored uniform. Ah, he sighed, that's nice of you. To reward you, she laughed, because you were such an obedient daddy. Now, what's it all about? The professor concealed nothing of his affairs, the malpractice, neglect, the dubious transactions. He spoke precisely, embellishing nothing. She did not interrupt him, and let him speak and confess. It's basically you who are to blame, he said. I could have dealt with everything, without any trouble. But I let it all slide, and devoted myself to you, and then the many-headed Hydra. The naughty Hydra, she mocked, and now poor Hercules has his difficulties. Now, little daddy, tell me what you are going to do.